I think the title we eventually alighted on was Dispute Resolution and the Environment Before and Beyond the Green Pledge. Noam, you're very welcome. We look forward to hearing whatever you have to say to us. Thank you.
I appreciate that, John, especially since, you know, it could be anything. And I wish you all could look into my heart and see just how thrilled I am to be here with you all. Of all the various mediation movements with different ideas and ideologies and agendas going on in our world, this has got to be one or the most dear to me. As John said, the idea has been with me for a long time. Radical no more. Wonderful. That point at which you realize that, oh, change happens and change has happened. I'm going to reflect a bit on the past decade and then throw out some ideas that might fall into the complicated side of things, even though I know that you're working towards simplification. But the main idea I want to throw out is in itself a relatively simple idea. So about 10 years ago, as I was, you know, increasingly recycling my waste and taking environmental considerations into my own personal activities and decisions, it struck me that every human activity has an environmental impact, including conflict resolution. Well, duh, and I know that I'm speaking to the choir, but of course that moment at which it hits you, that moment at which you consider the wait, I'm one of the good guys. I'm benevolent and I'm doing, you know, my actions are so well intended and I'm just trying to help. But from an environmental standpoint, they can be just as bad as harmful actions. It's quite a kick in the face. You know, the peacekeeping force that might ultimately get deployed to Ukraine at some point will burn fuel just as much as any truck used by the Russian military. Parties driving to a mediation session burn just as much fuel as attorneys or litigants driving to court, and so on. And that's a new lens and a new wake up that I know that many have experienced over the past decade. And once we're aware of this, we can begin to do better. And the Green Pledge is such a remarkable accomplishment in our efforts to do better. I'm going to travel sort of between that decade and the next and offer some suggestions on how perhaps we can make mediation an even more, hopefully the most environmentally allied form of dispute resolution there can be. So as John said, 10 years ago, I co-wrote this article identifying online mediation in particular, but online dispute resolution more generally as the most environmentally friendly form of dispute resolution, and going the academic route of supporting it with the case studies and numbers and some data and other academic type of groundwork. And of course, the response or the audible response was crickets, which is sort of Mother Nature's way of appreciating our work. And I'm not saying that I'm not mentioning this early work in order to claim that I and my co-author Colleen Getz were the first in this space, or that we triggered this. And no. I wrote an academic paper. They had little to no marginal effect. That is the truth of the academic side of my life. It's the burden of the academic. But the more important point is this. Many times we think that we're acting individually, independently, innovatively, that it's only us who sees what's going on and decides to act differently. We all think we're radicals, to use your word, John. And then later on, much later on, sometimes we discover that we've actually been part of a much larger group of people who've been moving in generally that same direction without us knowing about each other over time. I don't know how to call this phenomenon. You may all know the bandwagon effect. Just something starts to move, people jump on. And so I've taken to calling this the invisible bandwagon effect. Like people all jump onto something, they don't know it's there. And only after a while they realize that there's actually a bandwagon beneath them and people sitting to their right and to their left. Some of you might be familiar with this as what I call the baby name effect. You name your baby something really cool and sharp and innovative and from the heart and original. And, 20 years later, you look at a list of baby names, the most popular baby names from that year or two, and it turns out that your name is in the top 5. And no, it's not because everyone was copying you, but it's because of this sort of invisible bandwagon effect. So looking back at the period in which I wrote that article, I am sure that I was part of an invisible bandwagon, a slowly gathering stream of conflict professionals who were reaching that same, going through that same evolution in their personal lives, reaching the same understanding that this applies to their professional lives, and starting to take action. And while my own writing was part of this invisible movement, the Green Pledge is, in that sense, the first moment at which the bandwagon really becomes visible. And maybe moving from the bandwagon imagery to the iceberg imagery that mediators we love so well, seeing the visible portion of it, us in this room and all of the signatories and the supporters of the pledge, I can't help but think of who's still beneath the surface, in that sense of who's still part of the invisible bandwagon, those who are involved with the pledge, but haven't, they're aligned with the pledge, but haven't heard of it yet. And all those who will align with the pledge after another year or 3 of personal evolution. So let's keep this notion of an invisible bandwagon effect in mind, and I'll use it later to typify another trend that's going on in the field of dispute resolution and mediation in particular that I think that I'd like to channel in this talk towards environmental action. So if the Green Pledge is the bandwagon becoming visible, the iceberg rising above the waves in the present, I think that in that sense, and John, you mentioned this earlier, the COVID-19 era has been a boon to many things involving technology and including the Green Pledge. So here's to silver linings. The technological revolution of, I don't say we're post-COVID, I don't say that right now, but I do say that we're post at least the initial technological revolution of COVID, which has transformed our world, and it's transformed online mediation from being a fringe notion to reject, mainly, to a perfectly reasonable option to consider. So now parties and lawyers and mediators and judges and everyone has discovered, we've all discovered, that convening in a room isn't always essential, that travel can be spared, that it works. Mediation doesn't necessarily pay a price. Should we do this in person or should we do this online? Is now a reasonable question to ask, even just from a resources, from an efficiency point of view. Even without getting into the green aspects, talking about the carbon price of convening a mediation or the poison to the earth, the evil that is styrofoam cups. We don't need to get into this. We can, in fact, we can choose to either share our values-based reasoning of, hey, can we do this more environmentally, or even not, and just say, hey, how about online, and still score environmental gains. In this new world, I see a really bright future for the Green Pledge. Can we make that future brighter? I'm sure you all have a gazillion ideas, and you've noted that they've been raised at the previous meeting and in this meeting to make that future even brighter. I'm going to add one more to the pile. So in the world after COVID, the world after COVID, whatever it is not going to be the world before COVID. And one aspect of that is that, interestingly, online mediation is still going to be more environmentally friendly than face-to-face mediation. Interestingly, it might not be, and it might even be less environmentally friendly than conducting a court process. Given another invisible to some and visible to others bandwagon of the shift, the snowballing shift, which I research as well, that's a topic for another day, towards online courts. In other words, we might be in this odd situation where online mediation's green competition is not face-to-face mediation as it has been in the past, but it's actually court processes which going online and having their efficiencies might even be more environmentally friendly than online mediation. So this landscape of who are our competitors, so to speak, of online mediation have shifted. How do we get even better in this new landscape? So of course, Continuing to spread the Green Pledge as it is now is one way to do that, and it's one blessed initiative. What lies beyond? Well, you gave me the mic, and I'm used to, I came in with a decade's perspective, so I'm going to share something that I'd like to emerge in the next decade. And if this is either things that have been said in the past at your meetings or things that you really don't want to think about at this point, that's just fine. And my suggestion is to extend the values and the content of the Green Pledge a couple of steps further, maybe more than a couple of steps. The Green Pledge addresses all the ways that carbon and other harmful waste can be minimized in the mediation process and along the way to the mediation room itself. And what I'm going to suggest and support, as long as I have time to do it in, is that we bring environmental values not only in our convening, but into the mediation room itself. Whether the room is online or a physical room, that doesn't matter for this purpose. But what I'm talking about is giving environmental consideration as parties discuss the substance of their conflict and the substance of their deals. Once again, I think it's one of those things that I'm not the first to go down this path, and perhaps some of you already do this, and perhaps other of you have spoken about it. And still, I know that this is beyond the pledge. So whether I'm a radical voice in the wilderness or I'm just making another bandwagon a little more visible early on, here goes. Why should we bring environmental considerations into the room? Well, here's the thing. Some of the cases we mediate, and I'm particularly looking at large-scale commercial mediations, although it can pertain to other mediations, of course. In some of those cases, the environmental benefits we might garner from adjusting our travel, adjusting our convening, might only turn out to be a drop in the bucket compared to the environmental impact of the deal that we are sitting there and mediating. Remember, like every human activity has an environmental impact, and our own parties as human and their endeavors are no exception. We might find ourselves mediating deals with immense environmental ramifications. And of course, this is the time to stop me and say, hey, wait, no, you want us to start preaching environment to parties? It's enough that we've managed to sort of commit to it ourselves and sort of through the back door introduce it to the agreement to mediate. But we're not going to start preaching. Haven't you heard of mediator neutrality and party autonomy? Your bio says you've been in this field for a while. So yes, I have. But I also want to touch on an invisible bandwagon that I think has brought us to the point of introducing environmental consideration. But before I do that, let me talk about that issue of neutrality and autonomy, which is sort of the station that bandwagon departs from. Sure. We've all been taught about mediator neutrality and party autonomy, but also I think we all recognize that this has always been bounded neutrality. In other words, even those who give primary concern, and I am one of these, to party autonomy, we all know that there are cases in which even as we remain impartial between parties, we are not neutral towards an issue. And many, maybe most mediation models and laws and professional codes justify or require mediators to intervene in certain situations. Or they state that the agreements won't be valid if they cross certain lines, like they harm the public good, or they don't take into account the interests of a third party who's absent from the mediation. So, if Josie and Mary are considering resolving their dispute by murdering Tony, the mediator might intervene in some way and say, hey, etc. The intervention could be one of many, but this might be a case in which the mediator would intervene. For a grayer example, consider that Josie and Mary have a commercial dispute between their two companies, and they're considering resolving their dispute, and as part of that resolution, they're going to put Tony's company out of business. Legally, perhaps, but intentionally. This is a grayer ethical case for a mediator, maybe not necessarily addressed by all of these laws and codes. But for a bright light example that I think we all know is if Josie and Mary are resolving their marital dispute and they decide to agree on something which you as a mediator, after reflection, are pretty sure would be drastically detrimental to their young children. Do you intervene? Well, several laws come out, and say that absolutely you do. Different codes of conduct say you should, and your own personal ethics will also affect this. But the point being that the notion of mediator neutrality towards outcome and mediators' respect for party autonomy has always been bounded in one sense. So one way to directly apply that is to say, when we're looking at a situation in which there is severe negative environmental impact of a deal, or we think that there might be, it is easy to say that will directly impact dozens or hundreds or thousands of minor children who are not represented in the room at this moment. If you look 10 years ahead, 20 years ahead, a generation ahead. So that's sort of a direct application of this that some of you might think is kind of far reaching, and others might say, hey, actually, yes, children will be born with defects, or children growing up will grow up with one disease or another. That's real. But even if you don't, and you look sort of for the more general protection of an absent third party, and do we stand up for that absent third party, the environment, not the child? Do we intervene? I just like to cast a light on a bandwagon, and that bandwagon is the bandwagon of shifting neutrality. Neutrality has been a topic in mediation, of course, ever since ever. But it's also been debated over the past few decades, and particularly over the past 5 years, I think. Easy to count when those 5 years started. Many in the ADR movement, field, profession have been deliberating their commitment, I'd say, to the creed of absolute neutrality. And considering what the movement might have, or what I as a mediator might have to contribute in terms of advocacy, in terms of social organizing, in terms of activism. Again, it's a spectrum. For many, the trigger of this renewed thinking of the topic is a response to oppressive or crazy government, gender oppression, racial issues, other social justice issues. Can we maintain our neutral stance, which has nourished us and held us, and we've held it for so long, when we might be bolstering those who are on the wrong side of history? Maybe many have had these thoughts, and I'm not putting these words in your mouths. I'm reflecting, a bandwagon I've noticed. Maybe we are in danger of becoming Edmund Burke's, good people doing nothing with our neutrality. And many of us who identified with neutrality as part of core of our professional, but also maybe personal identity, have found ourselves coping uneasily in situations in which we're powerfully pulled towards one side or another in political and social and societal political conflicts. And the swell of these discrete personal evolutions, it's been very visible, following listservs, listening to people talk at professional conferences and other such venues over the past few years. And while at the beginning of this period, and in the United States, it was so visible around the 2016 elections, but continuing on from there, there was mainly confusion. And what do we do with this shaking up? In the latter part of this period, there have been many voices who are starting to sort of organize this more in a more structured manner, and just coming out and say that there's more we can do as mediators than either process guides or just process caterers to parties, or process caterers to parties' lawyers, as so often we are. And examples of this in writing, some of you might have read, Jen Reynolds from the University of Oregon wrote a chapter called, referring to ADR, saying the A is for activism. Bernie Mayer and Jackie Font Guzman, who some of you may know, very recently released their new book, The Neutrality Trap, which I can't recommend enough. Habib Shamoun did some work on a topic he calls transcendental negotiation, which posits that when negotiators negotiate with each other, they look out for their own interests, but they are also need to take into account future generations, their wider community, and so on. So what if I had suggested in 2012 that we need to bring environmental considerations in the room, that would have been purely radical. And I think that today it fits in a little more with the field's zeitgeist. So I have ideas for how to do this, and there are certainly many methods to do it and many levels of, how overtly do we step in and do it, but I'm out of time. So instead, I'm just going to share something that is framed very much like the pledge. I'm not suggesting this necessarily needs to be part of the pledge today. It's a personal commitment, and perhaps in a decade, it could be part of a wider pledge. But this is my pledge that I pledged after writing that back in 2012, and it went something like this. I will commit to encouraging those whom I mediate to include environmental considerations in deliberating the best way to resolve their dispute and as they plan toward the future. I have no doubt that the notion of including such a thing can generate mixed reactions. So whether I've riled you up, just tired you out, or given you food for thought, maybe for some, perhaps given hope for even a greater alignment between your values and your work, I appreciate no end what you're doing, and I appreciate your attention and your time. And if what I've said is either radical or a dreamer, so if I'm a dreamer, I know that again, I'm not the only one. Thank you so much.